Happy 4th of July. In this video I wanted to talk about the fascinating history which led up to the eventual approval of the Declaration of Independence on July 4th, 1776, which declared independence not only from the King of Great Britain, King George III, but also from the British Parliament. And so how long of a saga was that? Well, it took a long time. The real powder keg kind of went off in 1765 because of taxation that the British Crown was levying on the colonists through the Stamp Act. And it wasn't, by today's standards, it was a tiny fraction of the type of taxation that we have become accustomed to today. But it was the principle which angered the colonists, and they were already basically serving as subjects of the crown. That was the agreement. As more and more people came and settled from Europe into the East Coast, essentially, of North America, they all had to fall under the reign of King George III. So that was a very important event, the Stamp Act, which really kicked things into another gear. So here's this little passage which is very interesting that I found on military.com. The colonists were a melting pot of not only English, Irish, and Scottish, but also people from elsewhere in Europe and beyond. In many colonial communities, people spoke their native languages, adhered to the customs of their countries of origin, and practiced their own faiths. But they had one thing in common. They all had to swear loyalty to the King of England and submit to the law as a British subject, right? So that's the very key thing to understand here. That all was about to change. Over time, more and more of the colonists began to resent being under the thumb of Great Britain. This tension turned to outrage when the British Parliament imposed the Stamp Act in 1765, putting a tax directly onto the colonists for the first time. Although the tax was a relatively small amount, the colonists were enraged that they had no say in it. For them, it was a matter of principle, and although the Stamp Act was repealed the following year, in its place, Parliament imposed the Declaratory Act, stating that Great Britain had complete power to legislate the colonies. So, the issue of taxation and representation, and whether or not people were going to consent to being taxed. And so the issues of taxation and representation raised by the Stamp Act strained relations with the colonies to the point that 10 years later, the colonists rose in armed rebellion against the British. Over the next few years, violent rebellions were common as more and more colonists demanded freedom and viewed the British Parliament as corrupt. These seeds of rebellion would eventually flower into the creation of the United States of America as a sovereign nation, and that's a very important thing to understand, an important term to understand. The publication of Thomas Paine's stirring pamphlet, Common Sense, is what it was called, in early 1706 lit a fire under this previously unthinkable idea. The movement for independence was now in full swing. So another thing to understand about this whole, what's so fascinating about the creation of the United States and their Declaration of Independence from Great Britain was, this wasn't just, it's the only time in history that an armed rebellion has turned out in this way, in the sense that a solid bedrock of laws was put into place which allowed for the freest and most prosperous nation with the most prospect for upward mobility for anyone coming here when immigrants came. Now, of course, there was slavery, which was an evil which had to be corrected, and it was. But people don't want to acknowledge that slavery has happened all the way back to biblical times and beyond in every country, principality, place you can imagine, right? So the U.S. got rid of slavery, Britain got rid of slavery, and then other countries followed. I mean, Britain actually in the 1800s and 1900s expended lots of treasure and some blood trying to stop the slave trade, which was continuing in off of the coasts of Africa. They used their naval forces, a slave trade that they used to participate in. Anyway, that was just a little parenthesis that I think is important. But what came out of what often comes out of rebellions is nothing but chaos, and the system put in after is worse than the one that they overthrew. For example, Tsarist Russia getting overthrown by the communists, and then 60 million people being murdered essentially under Stalin after the promise of a utopia, right? So that's why we have to understand history to get a understanding of what these promises for utopia or these social programs which claim that they're going to fix everything being presented by politicians. We have to be careful and understand where these have led historically and what's actually going on under the surface. So back to the revolution, what came out of this was very unique because a system of laws was set up, from which everything could grow outward from a rural agrarian society into an industrialized society, which literally the main innovations that propelled the entire world into an era of increasing prosperity came from inventors in the United States. Thomas Edison, Charles Goodyear with rubber, creating rubber. I mean, think, how would we even do anything that we do today without rubber? I mean, it's in everything, you know, and from car tires to the gaskets in the engines to, I mean, it goes on and on, to appliances, everything. And a lot of these innovations were able to happen in America because there was this fertile climate and an entrepreneurial spirit and a sense of freedom and individual responsibility, which came from the individual liberties that were guaranteed by this new sovereign state that was set up, with a bunch of individual sovereign states under it, which initially were the 13 colonies, 2 of which, by the way, didn't agree to the Declaration of Independence when it was approved, but the rest of them did, and it went through. And the other thing that's so interesting about it is that this wasn't just some armed peasant rebellion against some mediocre power. Britain was the foremost world power. They had all the banking power, they had all the military power, the naval power, and they were able to project it all across the world to all of their colonies. So that was an incredible thing that the colonies were able to confront and carry out and persecute a drawn-out physical conflict with the most powerful empire on the planet and win, right? So then, again, fast forward from 1765 to 1776, July 2nd. July 2nd was when the Second Continental Congress convened, and July 4th was when it was actually approved, right? So that's why we celebrate July 4th. But the Second Continental Congress, which was the important thing to be aware of, was July 2nd, 2 days before. So now for the final part of this video, which I alluded to or I referenced in the beginning, is that I wanted to briefly go over, are we really still free? Where are we going? And I think it's a very complicated question, but I think it's also, without even any exhaustive research, just by looking under the hood a little bit, it's easy to see that we've lost many of our freedoms. They've been lost through promises of security, as there was that great quote, I believe it was Thomas Jefferson: "He who trades his liberty for security deserves neither liberty nor security, and he won't get either of them," essentially is what the quote said. And I mean, look what they did during the pandemic. I mean, it was just absolute trampling of civil liberties. But that was what really started to wake me up. But the more I looked into it and read and started to understand the bigger picture, I learned that that wasn't a new thing. This has been going on for a long time, right? And I've released these videos about the banking system, and I think that's a perfect segue because, and I'll link to those about the creation of the Federal Reserve System, this incredible book, The Creature from Jekyll Island. I'll link to the 2 videos I made about that, where I basically explain how our monetary system was created and how it was put in place as basically a direct link to the Bank of England, right? So England never gave up trying to co-opt and take over the US, and one might make a solid argument that in 1913 was when England got control of the US again, by getting control of the money supply and therefore the politicians and therefore the carrying out of wars on foreign soil, which were also something that I believe that one was George Washington, that he warned against foreign entanglements, especially those in Europe. Now, whichever one, whether it was Jefferson or Washington, said, be especially aware of and avoid getting involved in wars in Europe. But that all changed when we got a central bank, right? So this is big picture. This is how we have to start to try to tie everything together to understand where we're going, right? And for me, what set it off again was with the shutdowns. I said, what is going on? I mean, it's obviously not what I thought it was. I was pretty asleep about, you know, how we got here, where we are, and where we're going for most of my life. And most people go throughout their lives never, you know, even thinking beyond what is in front of them on a daily basis, or whatever TV show or movie they're watching, and then go to work and do it again and just kind of check out. But we've already entered an era where some argue World War III has already begun with the Russia-Ukraine conflict. We have an incredible amount of corruption and chicanery and conniving and deception that has basically become our political system in the US, which is, when combined, a very dangerous threat to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And we're pretty far down that road. So that whole model of kind of, you know, watching TV and checking out and just, I'll leave it to the bureaucrats to run everything as they run it into the ground, is reaching, I think, its latter stages. We're coming into an era, like I said, World War III has already potentially started. Notice the propaganda now hyping up China as a military adversary and threat, whereas if you said anything bad about China in 2020 or about whatever that happened with the influenza coming out of there, then you were racist. And now all of a sudden it's okay to say China's bad, China's a military adversary. How does that work? It was racist before, now it's good, now they're saying China bad, China bad. Same thing they do ramping up into all conflicts, right? Same thing they had to do with Germany. And I wrote about this in my article in Sign of the Times Brief yesterday. I'll put the link below this video. I highly encourage you to check that out as well. It's called War, Inflation, and Circuses: How Central Banks Destroy Nations and People. So I go into that topic that I referenced a few minutes ago. Anyway, we're getting into a very serious era. Not anything that can be denied when you just look at the facts that are in front of us, in plain sight every day. Everything from our energy infrastructure to our food infrastructure to our culture is all under attack, to our liberties. It's all being eroded very quickly. Now, I don't say this to be negative. I say this because it's like if you have an illness, how are you going to heal it or get to the root of it if you deny that anything's wrong to begin with, right? Or if you know, I did this once. I literally hit a boulder one time, cracked my crankcase,